All right, so welcome to another podcast. Today, my guest is Danny Nemu, who has written a really fascinating book, Neuro-Apocalypse, which I've been reading. And there's lots of fascinating stuff in there. We talk about consciousness and how if you speak Japanese, that's going to alter the way you perceive the world than if you speak English, and autism and savantism, and also psychedelic drugs and the Bible. So we're going to talk about all that stuff.
Stealing money from the poor's a bit rash. Line your pockets, fill your tanks with your rockets. Look at it, we just can't stop it. Loving your neighbour with bombs is wrong. Loving your neighbour with bombs is wrong. Just don't become late. That's the only rule. Loving your neighbour with bombs is wrong. Loving your neighbour with bombs is wrong. All been going on way too long.
In why people believe certain things rather than other things for forever, really. Going back to school, going back to my university, my academic background is the history and philosophy of science, technology and medicine. And I was really interested in how people's beliefs change. And from there, I kind of got into the neuro side of it, how thought works.
So it started with belief. You wanted to know why people believe things.
Yeah, why someone would be some religion, or why someone would... what is truth? Those kind of philosophical questions. I'm interested in science as a kind of new priestcraft as well. I was always interested in, I guess, what qualifies as knowledge and why someone believes in one thing or another.
Okay.
I had a background interest in that. I never intended to write a book, though. And when I was, sometime in my mid-20s, I started drinking Daime, which is a form of ayahuasca in Japan.
Japan? Okay.
Yeah, in Japan, yeah. So I was living there for 6 years, and after about a year and a bit, I got introduced to a group there. And so I drank that, and it was very kind of extraordinary stuff. And about a year after that, I had an interesting experience where I've always been insomniac, and my insomnia, the nature of my insomnia changed. And I found myself, I suddenly was seized with an idea, and I started writing it down very manically one night, and then went on for the rest of that year, just kind of really manically writing these scraps of paper late at night, and they all went into a folder. And sometime later, someone who'd read some other writing, something I'd written on the internet, some travel writing, asked if I'd written anything else. And she was the one who helped me kind of work my way through all these bits of paper and organize them.
Yeah. All these ideas around sort of like consciousness and all these kind of ideas, and then hone it into a book.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, first it was a question of expanding it out, and then it was a question of kind of cutting it down. So I worked on.
I want to go right into that idea. Like you said, so Daime is like an ayahuasca brew.
Yeah, it's a particular lineage of ayahuasca use. So there's lots of different ways of using ayahuasca from all over the Amazon.
So is it like I've heard of the Sante Daime? That's like
Santo Daime, yeah.
Santo, yeah. So is that the same organization in Japan that you were working with?
Yeah, that's right. So they there was a pair of Brazilian guys who started a group out there, and that's how I got involved. Yeah, so it's the same group. It's a syncretic way of using ayahuasca in let's say a folk Catholic format.
Right.
So it's not
it has a sort of Christian element to the ceremony. Yeah. So so that's what I was wondering so it was actually a Brazilian person who was leading that in Japan, because I hadn't heard of it coming from Japan, like the ayahuasca use. That's kind of...
No, indeed, but it kind of fits quite nicely with the Japanese temperament, because the way that we do it is quite formal in a way. You know, you're in your certain place, and a lot of the ethos of it is about building up stamina and building up strength and staying in your place. So we don't kind of let it.
So stamina for enduring the experience.
Yeah, staying on your feet, like and dancing all through the night whilst all that stuff's going on in your head.
While
and the
Japanese
like that kind of thing. Yeah. So the Japanese, they like to do things together. They like to do kind of collective rituals,
Hmm.
and they tend to be quite applied. When they get into something, they get really, really into something.
Okay,
So you
yeah.
had people going to the trouble of learning Portuguese, and
Oh, wow.
so yeah, it's not indigenous to Japan, but it did kind of fit in quite nicely.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so that was that experience that trigger. I mean, that makes sense, right? Is you have a psychedelic experience that completely alters your perception, and then to think, how does that work? How does that happen? How does my whole mind get shifted by taking a chemical or something? And then you started just breaking that down.
Well, so I was quite familiar with psychedelics from beforehand,
Okay.
as well, and also from meditation and other ways of messing with my head.
Mm.
I think what was quite surprising about the Daime was it wasn't actually while I was on it, and it wasn't while I was reflecting on it. It kind of came out of nowhere
Mm.
when I was doing something else. In fact, I was at a party when I got this kind of first, let's say, insight, and from that moment on, I used to find myself really being quite antisocial. I've written parts of my book in the toilet at weddings.
Yeah.
I used to moonlight when I had this one job translating in Japan, kind of scribbling away. So it kind of it seemed to open a tap that would, or a dripping tap. I don't know if tap's the right thing.
Right.
Open a kind of a wound that would kind of seep ideas into my
Maybe
head.
planted a seed, as they say.
That's a good metaphor, yeah.
Cool. So that's funny to get right into that. I think we'll maybe get into the psychedelic stuff a little bit afterward and talk about it, in the biblical stuff, which you talk about in the book. But before that, I wanted to ask, because you talk about this in the book, is how is the Japanese language? How does that change Japanese people's perspective in relation to people who speak English? Like, how is that perspective different?
Yeah, this is an area which really, really interests me. So a lot of my second book is about linguistics, and one of the chapters is a comparison of Japanese language, the English language, and generally Indo-European languages, and how that feeds into the psychology of perception and the nature of the culture as well. So I guess it's like this. The world is extremely complex, and we have certain filters through which it comes into our nervous systems. And one of those is linguistic. And so if you look at how the Japanese language is constructed, or you look at how the English language is constructed, and again, getting into biblical stuff, you look at how Hebrew is constructed, they're all really profoundly different on a very deep level. So it's not similar to the differences between, let's say, Italian and English. In Japanese, the noun isn't given a whole lot of description, right? So, for example, in English, you might say dog, you might say the dog, you might say a dog, you might say dogs. If you say I like dogs, I like your dog, I like this dog, it's all kind of different in English, but basically it's all the same in Japanese. You say inu ga suki, which means dog is likable, right? So it's not really clear without looking at the context whether you're talking about all dogs or one dog or anything like that. So the language right from the start, well, the nouns specifically and the language generally is a whole lot less defined. Just give me 1 second.
Yeah. I hear something there.
Yeah, that was my daughter playing the flute.
That's funny.
So let me give you another example. If you well, another thing is the noun comes first, right? So imagine we're all sitting around and we're thinking about what we want to have to eat. If you wanted to have a pizza, you'd start your sentence with I want pizza, right?
Yeah.
So you start your sentence with I. In Japanese, you wouldn't do that. You'd start your sentence with pizza, and then you would kind of look around and listen very carefully, and you'd see if people were like backing off, or if they were sucking the air through their teeth, or if they were going high and leaning forward. And then you start to construct your idea on the back of this noun that you've already presented, right?
Oh, that's interesting.
And the verb comes at the end, so it'd be pizza or tabe. That means pizza, and then there's a bit of grammar, and then tabe is about eating. But you don't know if you want to eat it, you don't want to eat it, or we're going to eat it, or you might say, I was thinking about having pizza, but actually I shouldn't have pizza. All of that would come at the end of the sentence rather than at the beginning.
Right.
So
how does something like that change people's actual perspective on the world around them and how they relate to people and things?
Yeah. So if you show an animation of fish in a tank to an American and a Japanese people, they will likely say different things about it. So a Japanese will nearly always say it looks like an aquarium, right? The first thing they will focus on the general rather than the specific, whereas an American will normally say there was a big fish, and then he'll go on to describe what the big fish was doing, right?
Yeah.
Japanese will refer to background features and refer to relationships between different features, whereas the American will tend to focus more on, like I say, what the fish is doing. And what's really interesting is if you then, like 5 minutes after the animation's been shown, if you take images of those fish that were in the animation and put them on a different background and show it to the if you show images of the fish on a different background, it doesn't make any difference to the American. You know, you say, was this fish in the thing? And he will say yes or no. Now, if you show that to a Japanese on a different background, then the Japanese is more likely to make mistakes and also takes longer to retrieve the information of whether it was there.
Okay, so that points to something, very ingrained then in how we are interpreting things.
Well, yeah, and it tells us that the individual is coded along with the context more so in the mind of a Japanese than it is in English. So you can extrapolate out from that, and you can look at how the culture works. And the Japanese, if you look at a stone garden, for example, you might be familiar. They often will have a big rock, and they'll have lots of pebbles contextualized around it, all kind of in circles around it, right? If you look at Japanese art, there's no tradition of still life in Japanese art because things don't really make sense in isolation. They make sense in context.
It's that big. You know what? That's funny. What you're saying reminds me of something else in your book. I think where you're describing autistic people and how they view the world, and that an autistic person will take in details before a big picture. And that other people, you can easily look at like a crowd of people and be like, oh, a crowd of people looking at someone talking to them. Whereas an autistic person might look at this crowd and say, yellow hair, blue shirt, this guy's tall, this guy's thin, this guy, and you see all these little details before you can extrapolate. And that's all very similar.
Yeah, indeed. Autistic people tend to be overloaded with information. You have reports of people going to the supermarket and just having to deal with thousands of prices and all that kind of thing. Yeah. So what English does, or Indo-European language, is it takes all that information and it systematizes it in a certain way, and then Japanese takes the information and systemizes it in another way, and the knock-on effects go right through the culture. So, for example, in Japan, you may have heard that an individual will only take half of their holiday because they're kind of linked in a very strong way to their context, which is their workplace. For example, if you were to take all your holiday, you'd be considered selfish, right? And you get it in sayings as well. I remember it's when I was a school teacher in Japan, and one of the things that was often said was the nail that sticks out should be hammered down.
Right. So that can be interpreted a few different ways, but they're less focused on, well, you could say being like a unique individual, a unique snowflake.
Yeah, exactly. So so in as a mature person in, say, England or in the States, you're meant to be independent, and that's an example. As a mature person in Japan, you're meant to be interdependent. It shows that
focused on that collective and community, which can be a really good thing too. Definitely.
Yeah, it can be rather stifling in certain areas. But you say all through the culture. So, like at a Japanese drinking party, you can't fill up your own glass because you look like an alcoholic. You have to fill up other people's glasses,
Is that
and you have to wait.
Oh, that's cool.
So wait patiently, and Japanese have different enzymes to me, so they get drunk a whole lot quicker. So I was often trying to direct the attention of the people around me to my empty glass.
That's funny, right? So one of the areas in the book that was really fascinating on the same line is looking at, so there's a whole spectrum of autistic people, right? Some people very high functioning with, can figure out things out socially and everything. And some people cannot. Some people are on a different end of the spectrum. And what's cool about it is that some of these people have really high abilities in other areas. So you call them like savants or things. And there are a few examples. One example that stuck out from the book was, and you got to tell me if this is even true, because I don't even know, because the example was a guy being able to read 2 pages of a book at the same time with either eye at the same time. Is that an actual case?
Yeah, that's Kim Peek. So Kim Peek, he wasn't actually autistic. He had something called FG syndrome, which is quite similar in a way. But the similarity is that the way his neurons work was highly diffuse, right? So
Diffuse.
I'll just explain that a little bit. With autism, there's lots of different reasons why people end up autistic, but one of the things which underlines it is about synaptic pruning. So when you're 3, between the age of say 3 and 16, the number of synapses that you have in your head, in your brain, is reduced by about half if you're neurotypical. But if you're autistic, it's not. So what it means is you have one particular neuron will have a big spread of synapses and connections to other neurons, right?
Yeah.
Now, this was similar for FG syndrome. Kim Peek himself, he didn't have what's called a corpus callosum, which is the bit of the brain which connects the right and left sides hemispheres of the brain.
They were operating more independently.
Yeah, exactly. So the guy could read one page with each eye.
That's really amazing, and that's like such an amazing example of how our physical brain, the physicality of it, how it's connected or not connected, can really change how we're able to think. It's really an amazing thing. It doesn't answer the question of whether consciousness itself is created from the brain, or if the brain is more of an antenna for this, because either way, the physicality could still change consciousness, but it really is fascinating to look at.
Yeah, so Kim Peek, the way he thinks is the way he thought. He's passed away now. Was also it was quite incredible actually. There was a little test done with him. He was played the first few notes of Beethoven's Fifth, which goes da 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 da.
Yeah.
And he describes his thought process. And so he converted in his mind. He very quickly, very rapidly converted that to ... which is Morse code for the number 5. So it's Morse code for V, the letter V.
Yeah.
Which is the Roman numeral for fifth, and it was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
Oh man, yeah.
So with this you can kind of imagine how the incredibly diffuse network would draw on all these different ideas in the guy's head. And the guy had, an unthinkable amount of information in his head, because not only could he read 1 page at a time, but he could remember everything in what he had read for decades. And he used to like going to the theater, but he had to stop because he would correct the actors on stage when they made a mistake, because he had everything coded in his head. So that guy, and autists generally tend to have better memories for lists of words, which is again quite interesting. So autists don't make categories in the same way, or rather they don't have
they don't group things together as in the same way.
Yeah, exactly, because they don't have an abstract concept of what the group might be, right? So so for example, an example that comes to mind is if you read a string of words of sweet things, so you read donut and cake and candy and stuff like that. Yeah. And you intersperse it with other words which are tastes, like bitter and sour and spicy. What will normally happen is that a person with a neurotypical person, if they're asked to remember those words and feed them back to you, they will have already grouped in their head sweet things, and they'll feed a bunch of them
automatically.
Back to you. Yeah, because we filter the world through what we've got, and we've already got these categories.
Right.
So
Yeah.
So now an autistic person won't make that mistake. He or she will feed those words back to you, and it's as if the individual detail doesn't get lost in the category, right?
So there's a
And
benefit to it in a way, because you're saying they'll repeat them back in order.
yeah, much more likely to repeat them back in order. And if you ask a trick question, which is the word sweet in the list, and that doesn't really work in with kind of Canadian words, but in English, obviously, sweet means candy is sweet. So sweet would fit into both categories. So if that test is run, but sweet isn't in it, and afterwards you ask the person, was sweet on that list? About 99% of neurotypical people will say yes, it was, because it kind of should be there. Because it's in both categories.
They just assume it's in that category.
Yeah. Whereas autists won't make that mistake because they don't have the category in the first place, or at least, I mean, you do get some high-functioning autists who will kind of generate themselves a category. Temple Grandin, for example, talks about how she had to distinguish between cats and dogs. Firstly, she distinguished by the size of them, and then her neighbor got a really small dog, and then she had to kind of rejig her category. In order to talk about the nose size.
Well, that's pretty cool too. Like that shows that it's different, but it's not necessarily always better or worse, though. You can think differently, and it can be useful in certain circumstances.
Absolutely. And when we talk about savants, savants are spectacular with their skills, but 1 in 10 autists has heightened skills in some area, which are above average, and that's only the ones that have been. Let's say that's in a culture where we don't nurture those kind of skills, and we don't really, and we were still talking about it as a disease and a condition, and things like that. But yeah, I mean, spectacular recall, all kinds of skills that come out of the autistic spectrum. I was just before we had the phone call, I was looking back at JMac, who was this guy who was the mascot of a basketball team, a high school basketball team, and the coach gave him the last 4 minutes of the last game in the season.
To play.
And in those 4 minutes to play, he never, he was really into basketball, but he used to, bring people towels and wipe up sweat off the floor and stuff. And in these 4 minutes, he shot 6 3-pointers. And he describes, it's quite interesting.
He shot and scored 3-pointers?
He shot and scored them, And he describes how the basket became massive in his mind, or massive in his eye. He describes it as a big old bucket that was huge. And another thing that's interesting about autists is that the way they, the visual cortex is much more developed than other people, right? The visual cortex, So what they will see, some autists obviously can't see. So you get some quite spectacular musicians as well. You can't see. But this thing about warping what we see, that happens to neurotypical people as well. A good example of it is if you have a gun pointed at you, if you're in a hold-up, and then you're interviewed afterwards, practically everybody in that situation will say the gun was bigger than it actually is. And they'll also say that people who are nearby, maybe 2 meters away, were actually 5 meters away, because we warp the entire visual scene.
You're hyper-focused on the danger.
Exactly, So we're doing this the whole time. Another example is if you point to a slope, a hill in the distance, and you ask a young person what the angle of the slope is, they're more likely to underestimate it. Whereas if you point to an old person, if you do the same with an old person or an unfit person, they're more likely to overestimate it.
That's funny,
If you point to that slope to a young fit person, but they're carrying a heavy bag, they're also likely to overestimate it, right? So
that's funny.
We're constantly warping this world, and this is kind of goes back to what I was really interested in, why people believe certain things, also why people see certain things, why they miss certain things, what's going on in our head, whether that's language, whether that's fear, whether that's psychedelics, or a whole host of other things. Various kind of atypical neuro conditions which make us perceive the world differently is also really, really interesting.
I mean, the whole thing reminds me of another example someone had used, that when you're walking with a child, say down a street, a young child, the child will look at every house you pass and notice all the details of there might be a dog out front, there might be a blue door, there might be this. Whereas we have these categories as adults, because we've seen so many houses, we can't waste our time and energy looking at every single house anymore. So we just kind of group them into categories, and we just see houses. We just see these like blocks that aren't really, we don't see the details anymore. But when you're young, you see that more. You see the details in things.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you see something similar. I'm particularly non-visual person. I remember with my ex-wife, I remember not noticing that she'd had a haircut.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's
because
yeah. I've done that one or two times. Yeah.
I know it's terrible. You just got married, man. You've got to watch out for that.
I know. I gotta be careful.
You've already kind of categorized someone. You see the same. People can have their eyebrows shaved off, and then look in the mirror in the morning, and they won't spot the fact they've got their eyebrows shaved off because they've already looked so many
They
times.
don't look. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. You just kind of glance. You just see it's your face.
I want to show you a bit of my book actually, which kind of speaks to this particular story. Just give me a second there.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. While you're looking, I could even just one more example I remember was talking about language, and there was one. You don't have to give more detail on this, but it was just some group of people that didn't have a word for blue, I think. And then when people were asking them to pick out a blue in a spectrum of greens and things, they had much harder time pinpointing that color because they just didn't have that reference point already. Yeah,
it's the Himsa tribe, but they've got different words for green. So they'll spot a green that we won't spot.
So they could see way more variations of green than other people could.
And Russians have got two different words for blue. They've got a dark blue and a light blue, and they can tell variations of blue better than English speakers. Yeah, it's kind of mind blowing, really. This is what I want to show you. If you can see that. But, what that says, people tend to read that as "please keep off the grass."
Yeah.
But if you look very carefully, it actually says, let me see if I can do this. Please keep off the grass.
I did not notice that. I didn't even see that.
Almost no one notices it because you look at it, you read the first couple of letters, read the first couple of words,
and then you just skip
go,
to the last bit. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's how it works. Now, autists are much less likely to And interestingly enough, if you stimulate certain parts of the brain with transcranial stimulation, then people are more likely to spot those kind of tricks, and they also become better at drawing. There's quite interesting images of people who've tried to draw a dog before and during and after inhibiting certain parts of the brain.
Inhibiting parts, Okay.
Yeah, inhibiting because it's the temporal lobe which does the categorizing and does the association cortex, right?
Yeah.
So if you inhibit the certain parts of the association cortex, those categories don't really kick in quite so clearly.
So you might see more. You might draw more detail in a dog then.
Yeah, exactly. And people do, and they also describe how, having learned how to draw a dog, it kind of stays with them after the after the simulation's finished. So there's other ways of getting to these places. Another one was with psilocybin, obviously.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask before you go into that, how do you inhibit certain parts of the brain?
Oh, you pass a magnetic field through it. So you basically you put someone's head in a machine, and with the rest of their body,
and they can pinpoint certain areas and just.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, is that not dangerous for a person?
There's actually kits that you can buy, so you can buy them off the internet, and you can start doing it yourself.
Oh my God! People don't do that.
People do that.
Don't
I wouldn't do
it. That sounds crazy. So I didn't. So you can. Because that is something in psychedelic research, like with psilocybin, I think with LSD, is they've seen that when you're ingesting these things, they're actually inhibiting certain parts of the brain, and then other parts of the brain are connecting that weren't normally connecting.
Yeah, exactly. So with the psilocybin research, actually, it was my brain in some of the psilocybin research. I sat in one of those.
Is that right?
One of those things, yeah, and they kind of made me. Maybe tap buttons.
Oh, that's neat. So you took psilocybin and were studied.
Yeah. The Imperial research. So what happens with psilocybin? They found is that it inhibits connector hubs in the brain. The bits which integrate different sensory input and also input from other places like memory and things like that. So a good example of that would be synesthesia, which is something that often happens when you're tripping.
Yeah.
And certain other situations. Because you've got some bit of information, you've got part of your brain which is saying it's a sound, and you've got another part of your brain which is kind of getting mixed up with it. So synesthesia is usually the mix is seeing sounds,
Right.
and the visual cortex will get affected in a way that it shouldn't really be.
Well, that's just
or
like what you
normally
described
be.
with the one fella who heard, was it Mozart or something, and the dun 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 dun, and he visualized that as dot 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 dash.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that, and it's very interesting if you look at the map of how neurons and how different centers of the brain connect while people are on psilocybin. It's a very distributed network. Robin Carhart Harris, who was doing some of the research, he used a very interesting metaphor to describe it. He says, what would happen if you bombed the capital city, if you wiped out the capital city of a country? And he said, well, there'd be a lot of confusion, there'd be a lot of chaos, and then links would be made between different cities as they started to trade with each other, and they develop their own networks.
Right.
So you get different bits of the brain which aren't. And they go into phase. So you get parts of the brain which are not normally in phase going into phase. So you might have memories coming back, which would be compartmentalized. You might see something when you're, let's say, tripping in the woods, which might trigger a certain memory because of some signature, some aspect of it which reminds you.
Right.
So we get.
You can see how stuff like that happens. Like even just looking at like smells and how smells seem so linked to memories as well, and like it's just linked for some reason. It's just a connection is made faster.
It's the deepest part of your brain. Or rather, of all the senses, they go right the deepest, like physically into your brain.
That's funny. That's so. I wonder why. It's interesting.
Well, here's something else interesting. I mean, most of the time we're thinking about perception and sight, and occasionally in hearing. But even when you're hungry, right, your stomach produces something called ghrelin, which is a hormone, and it makes you more likely to notice the smells. It basically makes your smell more accurate, and also in rats it makes them do more what's called exploratory sniffing, which is when they kind of and it's all, and in humans it's linked to, if I remember this correctly, it's linked to adrenaline, which is more likely to make you get up and go and wander near the kitchen where you might
food. That makes sense, I guess. Yeah.
So, I mean, we kind of think of ourselves as autonomous, and on some level we may be autonomous, but we're also constantly reacting to all kinds of external and internal
definitely
modulation of stimulus.
Right. Yeah, for sure. We have this idea that we're like we're so in charge of ourselves, but we're operating on so much habit and so much, and not just habit, but all these things that trigger certain senses, hormones, different perceptions that lead us to do certain things. It's interesting. So maybe this is a good point probably to jump into the biblical psychedelic drug sort of talk. Very interesting stuff. So let's see. One of the things that's kind of clear from looking at it a bit and reading what your book is, like, you could definitely say at the very least there are a number of substances in the Bible, but it seems like many of them are fairly low level, maybe like small sedatives or in incense and things that people are using with small effects. But the big question and what people are so interested in is this idea of like powerful psychedelics actually being in major parts of the biblical stories when it comes to people reporting visions and communication with God or angels and things. So do you think that is the case in some areas?
Yeah, there's quite a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Right? So this is the last question. The visitations of God names, angels, the extraordinary experiences in the Bible, I don't think many of those were triggered by substances. When you're looking in the book of Daniel or Job, or who else have we got? Enoch, for example. Those experiences of the angels and so on and so forth, I think they were triggered by, well, some of them are triggered by certain holding certain postures. Some of them are triggered by sadness, which is quite an interesting one. because if you stress rats, then the amount of 5-MeO DMT in their brains increases. Actually, stress increases the amount of endogenous DMT in our bodies.
Really? So
yeah.
it speaks to people putting themselves in states of high stress, maybe fasting or things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, lack of sleep as well, that will trigger
or extreme
things.
darkness. I've heard as well.
Yeah, so Strassman looks at these, and he's got a bit of a different perspective on it to me. But certainly in terms of the prophets, it doesn't look like they're using any psychoactive. So I wouldn't want to reduce all of the experiences
Right.
of the weird or the other in the Bible to psychoactive experiences.
Right.
Where you do find those substances is in the Tabernacle, which the Israelite priests were privy to. They were allowed into it. No one else was allowed in. In the Tabernacle, all kinds of things happen.
So can you explain what is the Tabernacle?
Tabernacle is a big tent, basically. It's described over 5 chapters of the Bible. Nothing else gets anything like that much detail in the Bible. It's like the story of Babel is over in half a chapter. This gets 5 chapters, and it's about how the space between the hooks and how many hooks and what shape the frame is of this tent. And what the tent that's produced is, in simple modern terms, it's a hotbox, right? Particularly the back end of it is I think it's a 4.5 meter cubed chamber, which has a frame around it, acacia frame, funnily enough, acacia being the highest concentration of DMT in the whole region. But anyway,
acacia is a tree?
Yeah, it's a number of trees. It looks like it's Acacia Sayal that was the one.
Right. These trees that contain high amounts of DMT.
Yeah, but there's nothing in the Bible about those about DMT being used. There's Benny Shannon had a speculative hypothesis about an ayahuasca analog, but you don't need to speculate. Actually, there's already plenty in the Bible. So you've got this hot box, right? So you've got the frame, and then you've got 2 skins pulled tight around it, and then you've got 2 other skins which act as a windbreak, and it makes one of the skins is a very thick leather that was made to used to make shoes as well. So it's a kind of it seems to be an impermeable leather, then it's sealed with a veil at the back. Now the veil is described, at least in times of the Roman temple, in the times of the Jewish temple, it's described as very thick. In fact, the thickness of the breadth of a man's hand, which means it's not like a normal veil. Like the exit of the tabernacle has a normal veil, but then you've got this kind of special chamber in the back, which has this thick veil, which is a smoke trap. And what happens in there is the high priest goes in there alone and burns huge amounts of incense, like handfuls of incense, finely ground incense. And the incense has got about 16 ingredients. I'll tell you what they are.
Here, can I just ask, is this idea, even without getting into any of the psychedelic stuff yet, just this huge amount of incense that the high priest would go in and use, is that debated at all? Or is that pretty... No, that they were definitely doing that.
That's God's word, that is.
Okay, yeah. Can't argue with that, then.
And also, the chemicals in there are not debated. I mean, there's a little bit of discussion over which kind of Boswellia tree the frankincense might be, for example. But no, it's the substances are well known. There's one which is, let's say, more speculative, which is something called Cannae-Bossem, or Cannae-Bossem, which it's in the time of the Talmud, which is a later book. It's become fused into one word, which is Cannae-Boss, and it's
sounds like cannabis.
It is cannabis, basically. If you look at lilinguistic evidence and a whole lot of other evidence, every single tribe around the Israelites had a word for it, and they were using it. And the Scythians, for example,
were
visited.
Common, then.
Yeah, it's really common. It was found, the Scythians were visited by Herodotus in about the 5th or 6th century BC, and he describes them throwing cannabis. He describes them like folding down the flaps of the tent and then making a fire and then throwing cannabis on the fire, and then everyone jumping up and singing for joy. and he actually says it exceeds any Grecian vapor bath. And so you've got it there, you've got it down in Egypt as well. It was found in Ramesses II's mummy, and you've got archaeological finds of cannabis, both used topically and used as a smoke in Israelite territory itself. So there's no doubt that it was used there, and there's still some people who will argue whether Cannae-Bossem is, I mean, what it's normally translated as calamus, which doesn't fit at all. Calamus is a reed, and we know that Cannae was used to make shirts for the dead, and you can't make shirts out of reeds because it will decompose pretty much
Whereas
immediately.
hemp is very good for making clothing.
Yeah, exactly. So one kind of line of inquiry is around the hemp. That's in the anointing oil, which was put upon the priests in a massage. In fact, it's called shemen hamishcha, and the word mishcha comes from mashah, which is to wipe or to paint or to massage it. Some people think that it's where we get the word massage from. Mashah becomes the word massage. So there's a massage oil which contained 4 ingredients. That was cannabis, myrrh, cinnamon, and cassia, right? Maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about them because it's quite interesting.
Sure.
And a little bit complex. You've got an enzyme system, the cytochrome system in the body. It's got 57 different enzymes. They're called the P450 enzymes, and they're all called things like CYP-D26 and CYP2A1, right? Now, so you've got 57 of them. 5 of them are involved in 90% of drug metabolism. So whether you take MDMA, whether you take steroids, whether you take whatever it is, it's pretty much all of it is broken down by 5 enzymes. And 4 of those enzymes are inhibited by cinnamon.
Really?
Right? Yeah. The 5th one, which is not inhibited by cinnamon, is inhibited by cassia, which is another form of cinnamon. The cinnamon that you get in the shops is quite often cassia. They call it Chinese cinnamon. It's used in Chinese medicine. So my psychoactive studies by the end of the year, this will be coming out, is that the combination of essential oils or of oils in the anointing oil that was put upon the priest, which is wiped all over them. Well, we know that it's got all kinds of quite interesting and powerful psychedelics in it. It's got estradiol, it's got eugenol, it's got LMSin, it's got all the stuff, a lot of the stuff that's in nutmeg, right? Now, nutmeg can be a really powerful psychedelic because it's got both allylbenzenes, it's got these powerful psychedelic chemicals in it, but it's also got inhibitors which inhibit your enzymes so you don't break down those chemicals before they get to your brain.
Right.
And that makes sense.
So,
right?
I was a little bit confused talking about the cinnamon and how it can, does it work where, like, if I were to use a bunch of cinnamon and then use, say, like MDMA or something, or would it inhibit me from the MDMA taking effect, or would it increase the effect? I was confused there.
MDA,
or is that even a good example?
Think about it. No, it's a good example. It inhibits the enzymes which break down drugs, right?
Breakdown, as in, so breakdown in the way like you'd break it down and not, it wouldn't have effect.
Yeah, exactly. So they're in your gut, in your liver, in your skin. You've got enzymes. So
it would increase the effect then of these things.
Well, of MDMA, I'm not sure, but of MDA-like compounds, which you've got in the anointing oil, I'll just find out exactly what they are.
So it's a little similar, you could say, to the ayahuasca brew with the MAOI, which is
yeah, exactly.
Allows the DMT to take effect.
Yeah, that's right. So you've got let me just see if I can find them. MDMA. Estradiol, eugenol, LMSin, and safrole, right? They're all in the oil which is put on priests and kings, right? Safrole is what you make MDMA out of normally. It's the raw material for it, right? Now, unlike MDMA is particularly special because it doesn't get broken down in the body, or at least it takes a long time for it to be broken down in the body, so it gets to the brain and does all kinds of funky things.
Right.
Estradiol, LMSin, safrole, these things, they tend to get broken down either into something completely inactive, or they get broken down to something which is mildly sedative.
Okay, yeah? I see, yeah.
But if you've inhibited your enzymes, then no, it'll go straight to your brain. And they also potentiates THC as well. In myrrh, which is one of the other ingredients, you've got 3 different opioid receptor agonists, and obviously they have both analgesic kind of pain-killing effects, but also mood-enhancing effects and euphoric effects.
So are you saying that these priests, if they would use this oil that would contain these inhibitors, and then they would go hotbox?
Yeah, well, only the lucky high priest. So the other priests, they used the oil, and then they got to eat something called showbread, which we don't really know what that is. I'll come back to that in a minute. But yeah, the high priest would use the oils, and then you go into the hotbox. So the stuff that he was hotboxing, he was already. It would have been doubly potent for him because his inhibitory system was also inhibited.
Wow, okay.
Plus he just totally oiled himself up with cannabis.
Yeah.
So then you got the showbread as well, right? I'm going to find you a nice little quote for that. The showbread. There's a book called A Guide to the Perplexed. It's by Maimonides, and he's describing all of the various different aspects of Jewish culture, and he gets as far as the showbread, and he says, I don't know. He says this is a complete enigma. We don't know what this is about at all. So there's a quite interesting little bit of text I'm going to read. This is from the Talmud, right? Let me see if I can find it for you. So the showbread is what they eat on their own. Okay, I'm going to read it. So this is what the normal priests eat after they've been oiled up. Right?
Okay.
In High Priest Simeon the Upright's time, every priest who received only the size of an olive became satiated, and some was left over. But after him, these things were cursed, and every priest got only the size of a bean, and the delicate priest refused to take it altogether, but the voracious ones accepted and consumed. It once happened, one took his own share and his fellows. He was nicknamed Robber till his death. Right. So we're talking about super tiny doses,
small amounts
of this bread. You've got one high priest who makes it better than others, which is also quite interesting. Right. And then you've got some priests who find it Moorish. They're going after more, and they're kind of nicknamed Robber. And then you've got other ones for whom it's a little bit too much, which you can also imagine.
Yeah,
all
that
of that
speaks
to
to
well.
more than just some. So is this like the interpretation in like standard interpretations of the Bible and things? Are people just interpreting this as bread, just food?
Well, that's what Maimonides says. I don't know. And he's one of the greatest sages of all time. I think so. But it's just the doses make it kind of very difficult.
Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? And why would they oil up and then go eat a loaf of bread, like tiny crumb of bread? Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, does it?
unless you're very, very high. So one of the things that's quite fascinating about coming back to the category and how the category obscures the detail. You get people who are textual scholars, you get people who are biblical scholars who know absolutely nothing about psychopharmacology, and you get psychopharmacologists who know nothing about the Bible. I know a little bit about both, and it's not very complicated. I mean, frankincense. We've got the list of the ingredients. We've got frankincense, right? We know that frankincense. You can just look up the psychopharmacology of it. We know it's got incense acetate and it's got dehydroabiatic acid. And we know that one of those is a GABA receptor agonist. It works on the GABA receptors. It tranquilizes you. And we know the other one works on the TRPV3 ion channels, which is distributed in the skin and is involved in temperature sensation. And it's also distributed in the brain, where we know nothing about it. We don't know what it does in the brain, but we do know that frankincense was carried, 3000 BC. They were already taking frankincense all the way from Oman through 1,500 miles of robber-infested deserts, all the way so that Pharaoh burn it. So the idea, one of the Pope's favorite theologians, he talks about this prodigious waste of a precious material and what a beautiful symbolism this is. It's complete nonsense. I mean, we know that it acts as a tranquilizer. We also know, actually, from Persian medicine, that cinnamon was used as what they call a convoy medicine. So we know that if you were treating a liver problem, you'd give someone a certain thing for the liver, but you'd also give them cinnamon because it aids absorption of the other drug. And the reason it aids absorption of the other drug is because it inhibits the enzymes, which would otherwise. So we kind of have a.
They know, like we know that they would have known about these properties of these things.
Well, I mean, that'd be nice, wouldn't it? But I think it's kind of, I think we just kind of assume that the ancients were just fumbling around with trial and error and not really getting anywhere. If you compare it to our own medicine, like if you look at indigenous Amazonian medicine, for example, where they were using monoamine oxidase inhibition for several hundred years at least
Yeah,
to
right.
make ayahuasca, right? We didn't develop in the West. We didn't discover monoamine oxidase inhibition until I think in the 40s. It was
Right.
discovered by mistake.
Yeah.
And it was, and what have we done with it? We've made antidepressants, which are they're thought to be slightly more, slightly better than placebo at treating depression. And over in the jungle they made ayahuasca, and they
Right.
made it hundreds
So,
of years ago.
and they didn't have
Uh,
all the scientific method and all this stuff. So,
I met Professor Nutt, who was the
yeah, David.
advisory council. Yeah, that guy. So he told me that every single class of psychiatric drugs was discovered by mistake. Right. So
Right.
nitrous oxide was also discovered by mistake. Acid was discovered by mistake. But yeah, everything, all of them, lithium.
Right.
So we have this idea that the ancients, the Amazonians, are bumbling around with trial and error. We know for sure that we're doing it by trial and error. Well, not even by trial and error, by error generally.
Yeah. It just happened to, yeah. So so what you're saying is it's very, very possible. It's just very unlikely, probably, that they were able to figure this out by testing these different herbs and things.
Yeah, testing, or perhaps what the indigenous people would say in the Amazon was that the plants told them, right?
Right? Yeah. So you can speak to some divine or yeah. Well, so let's go to you're talking about what the lower priests were using, but is it then is it come to this idea of manna that the high priest is then using? Or is that a different? Is that not the same situation after rubbing down the oil and all that?
Well, manna comes into it as well. So the up with myrrh, with its opium, with its opioid receptor agonist, cannabosum, which looks like cannabis, and then cinnamon and cassia, which are inhibitors. And then he goes off into the smoke box and uses a mixture of things like spikenard, for example. Spikenard's interesting. It's the stuff that Jesus's feet are oiled with. And Judas complains. They say, "Why are we using this expensive stuff on Jesus's feet?" Right? Spikenard boosts serotonin, it boosts GABA, and it boosts dopamine, and it assists in memory formation. Right? Wow. So in rats, I think it makes them remember how to get through mazes better.
And if you were to rub that onto your feet, you would absorb it effectively that way?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean they rubbed it all over their body, but yeah, definitely. I mean, there's in Chinese medicine you get kind of foot baths and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a common way of using medicines. But then you've got other ingredients. You've got like myrrh, you've got frankincense, you've got what else? A couple of different types of myrrh. Then you've got gosh, it's all slipped my mind now. What else have you got?
Would it be? Are you also throwing DMT into the mix?
No. Well, that's an interesting question, right? So what you've got in there is you've got something called agar wood, which is oud in Arabic, and that's got loads and loads of stuff in it. I have heard, I haven't found it published, but I have heard that they have also found DMT in agar wood. So the resins which are listed in the Talmud, which are in the smoke incense, is myrrh, cassia, cinnamon, spikenard, saffron, which is where you get saffron from, and also saffronal. Saffron's interesting stuff. It was in the Islamic tradition. It's described as one of the drugs which causes joy, right? So it's not prohibited in Islam, and the effect of it is said to be like opium. Costus, Sassarea costus, agar wood, and mastic. So you've got all of those things going into the smoke.
A lot of stuff.
Yeah. So some of them are nootropic. It means they help your memory. Some of them are sedatives, tranquilizers. Sometimes, again, the category when we call something a tranquilizer, we might think, it makes you tranquil. Right. Tranquilizers could do some extraordinary. Opium is a tranquilizer because that can do some extraordinary things to your mind. Right. So. Yeah, the nomenclature can kind of get in the way a little bit when we're thinking about them. Yeah,
for sure. Well, even what was it? Was it ketamine? It was a tranquilizer as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that can, that's a full on experience to take something like that.
Yeah, they weren't using that.
Yeah.
And what's also quite interesting about it is that so that mixture is also very similar to kifi, which was a incense used in Egyptian temples as well. And it seems that there's some kind of line of transmission of knowledge between Egypt and Israel. Because the oil itself, right, the Egyptians made an oil with myrrh, cinnamon, and cassia in it. It was called the mendesium, and it was exported actually from the Bronze Age to outside of Egypt. And then the 1,000-odd years later, the Israelites turn up using the same mix of myrrh, cinnamon, cassia, and also putting Tane into it as well. So there seems to be some kind of line of transmission of arcane knowledge.
So so going back to the high priest and going into basically hotbox. I mean, for one, were they hotboxing because did they have pipes then or no?
No,
they didn't have. Okay, so that makes sense. So that's how they could inhale this stuff, is just by lighting a big fire with it and getting it going, like getting a whole room going with it. So what would be what is the high priest's purpose at this time to use? What would he then come out with afterward? What was sort of the purpose of this?
Prophecy.
He'd come out with a prophecy.
So I mean, you get this in other smoke tent or smoke box traditions. So, for example, the oracle at Delphi used to burn laurel and henbane and myrrh, some of the same chemicals in a cave, right? And then she'd come out with prophecy.
Right.
So yeah, it was about divination, and which is quite interesting, I think, especially the neurotropics that are in there, the stuff that help you form memories. Could you imagine it? You're really, really mashed, and you're getting all this kind of information,
right?
And then you've got to try and remember it.
Yeah, right. That's a really interesting idea, actually. Yeah,
especially think about it with THC. That can really do a number on your short-term memory.
Absolutely.
But there's things like some of the allobenzines have been tested, and they reduce the memory, let's say the memory disruption of THC. I think it's acetylcholinease inhibition. I can't remember the exact details of it, but yeah.
And this was like this high priest going in and doing this was like a once a year sort of thing.
Later on it's once a year. When Moses is doing it, he's kind of in the tent quite a lot because they were doing active divination at the time. Traditionally, in shamanic cultures, divination is used for diagnosing diseases, for example.
Yeah.
Both of collective and of an individual. It's also used for finding access to game and to water, for example, which Moses does both when he's divining in the in the Tabernacle, and it's also used for military tactics. So in the ayahuasca has been used as a weapon of war as well, because you're kind of with kind of heightened sensitivity, you can perhaps hear your enemy attacking, and if you have super heightened sensitivity, you might be able to get into your enemy's mind and know when they're going to attack you, so you can go and attack them.
I mean, people on ayahuasca have talked about going right out of their body and flying across the landscape. So I mean, you might be able to go get some intel or something.
Yeah, exactly. I reckon DARPA are onto it.
Oh yeah. Well, okay. Well, I do want. Okay. That actually reminds me of a question I want to ask. But first, I do want to get into the idea of manna then, and because that's something you do write about it in the book, and that you relate it to Ergot, that it could be.
Yeah, so manna ends up in the Tabernacle along with everything else, and it ends up in the high priest's bit of it. So no one else gets their hands on manna after the trip through the wilderness, right? Manna is described in the Bible as like coriander, white, like coriander seeds, white and resinous, right? It's also described as like a frost on the ground. And those are the two formats in which you find ergot, because ergot is a secretion. It drips out of various plants, and it either dries on the branch where it forms these little pellets.
Because ergot is a fungus?
Yeah, it's a fungus, yeah.
Yeah.
It appears at the onset of spring, which is when the Israelites find their manna.
Okay.
It appears where you have vegetation. And therefore water, and the Israelites, they don't find it when there's no water, they only find it when there's water.
Okay.
And then they find it in the format, the taste of it is the same as manna. Manna is described as having the taste of honey, and ergot secretion does have the taste of honey. And then what's really interesting is the preparation for it in the Bible is you grind it, and then you boil it, and then you bake it, right? And if you do that to ergot, what you do is you separate out the insoluble parts of it, which are the poisonous parts, and you get left with basically crystals of something which contains LSA, which is a close cousin to LSD,
Right.
and a super powerful, rather pleasant psychoactive.
So they would be able to extract that fairly simply. Then it would they're not actually making LSD as we know it, but something similar that can be extracted through a more of a primitive process.
Yeah, so Hofmann himself, who was the first guy who extracted LSD out of ergot, he used ergot himself. He said that the process was very much available to early man.
Really?
It's easy. You just boil it.
Right.
And
okay.
then
Well,
bake
that
it.
doesn't sound too complicated.
And you grind it. So the grinding is interesting as well, because you get other secretions in the desert, but most of them, like you get something called man, for example, which is a kind of it's a more gummy secretion, which is used as a food by Bedouins, but it's you can't grind it. So ergot also it's brittle. You can grind it.
So you're saying Moses was taking something like LSD in this tabernacle?
There's not. I'm just wondering. I don't think there's a specific reference to him taking manna, but he's the guy who knows what manna is, because the Israelites look at it and they say, "Is this?" Well, it's a bit complicated, but they say something which could be translated as "What is this?" But there's problems with that translation. Okay. It also could be translated as "This is man," and man is a Bedouin word for something else. And Moses goes, and the line goes like this: it says, "They said this is man because they wist not what it was, because they didn't know what it was. So clearly they're wrong." Moses says, "This is the bread which the Lord gives you." I think that's the line like that.
So
he knows
that word bread again. They're using this word bread for these things. Yeah. So I mean, I've heard
bread
people have written to me in this. I think it must be from these same parts of these stories, and they're referring often to bread as psilocybin. That's something that people have written to me and talked to me about, and that's something that's been passed around a bit. But it seems like there maybe is more evidence that like it's these things that you're describing.
The mushroom thing, man. Tom Hatzis has just completely demolished that argument as far as I'm. There's not a single reference to it in the Bible. Like there's in Christian traditions later, you've got people quite openly talking about the various different psychoactives they're using, whether that's mandrake, whether that's cannabis. I think henbane. It's not really my field, but there's no reason why they would hide the fact that they were using mushrooms. Right? It wasn't prohibited. It's not something that was unkosher. It's not like pork or something.
In those days.
It wasn't prohibited then. So there's the evidence for mushrooms is like, church windows with something that looks like a mushroom in it,
right?
Stuff like that. So there may well have been later traditions which did incorporate mushrooms into it, but there's clearly none. There's no evidence.
You wouldn't translate these instances of talking about bread as that. You think something else. Okay.
No,
so who did use this manna then? Who was actually documented using it?
The Israelites, they use it all together. They all take it together, and one of the things that they see when they're taking it is they have a synesthetic experience. So when they're looking up at the mountain, they see the thunder and the sounds of the trumpet. They see the sounds of the trumpet, right? And it's the only example of synesthesia in the entire Bible. It's also the only example of a collective vision in the Old Testament, right? And in fact, very rarely in scripture, like world scripture, do you get collective visions. You get individuals who see things, but you don't get a whole group of people. So the only time you do get a whole group of people seeing synesthetic something at the same time is when they're taking manna.
And that is something that's reported from people using LSD, for sure. I've heard that directly.
Oh, well, collective visions.
Yeah. People sharing an experience and synesthesia as well.
Yeah, my friend Andy Roberts, he's written some books on acid. He was describing being at Glastonbury and a conversation between, I think, 4 people in a tent, all of whom were seeing a spaceship coming down and people coming out of the spaceship, and this whole experience they all had together.
Yeah. So that seems like pretty good evidence that could have happened, that this group of people did use this ergot substance.
We've got in modern times, we've got a collective, a mass apparition. In 1917, the Virgin Mary appeared at Fatima in Portugal. Right, there were no psychedelics involved, but literally thousands of people saw something.
Yeah.
Right, and it was the third. It was announced, so there were reporters there, loads of reporters, and like thousands, I think even tens of thousands of people. And some people saw the sun dancing around the sky. Some people saw the sun getting bigger. Some people saw light as if coming through a stained glass window. People saw really radically different things.
Yeah,
because it was happening in their heads.
But it was at the same time.
But at the same time, yeah. And when I say that it was happening in their heads, that doesn't mean to say that it wasn't happening outside their heads as well. I wouldn't want to reduce the gods to experiences in our heads. But
Right.
I think certain techniques, certain technologies, certain psychedelics give us access to seeing them. Same way, if I take off my glasses, then you kind of go a bit out of focus. And if I put on my glasses again, then you're in focus again.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean to say you're not there.
Yeah, and just what we were talking about, but I mean, it kind of relates to the start of our conversation, talking about how how our brains really do create our reality and our language and all these other things, but that we're all interpreting what's going on around us in our minds. So you can say we see it in our minds in a way, but that's how we're interpreting the world outside as well. So it's all kind of the same, really.
Yeah, they say seeing is believing.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of scary. I've seen all kinds of crazy things in my...
Yeah, I couldn't trust that. So the other thing that I wanted to get to, after talking about this, like, if it's true that these, whether it's the high priest or this group of people that use this stuff, and especially the high priest situation where they're using it continuously for purpose, do you think then that is there some sort of conspiracy at some level in high levels of the church that they maybe knew about this, that they know about it now, or has it been kind of forgotten and dismissed without a sort of conspiratorial twist?
Yeah, interesting. There's a guy called Dan Merker who wrote a book, I think it's called The Mystery of Manna, and he traces through the Talmud and later Christian writings cryptographical references which he interprets as the continuation of the knowledge about manna being ergot, right? I don't know enough about the Talmud to be able to decide either way if he's just finding it or if it's actually there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's certainly kind of plenty of speculation that the knowledge stayed alive. Whether there's a conspiracy or not, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Yeah,
it's hard to say.
No
right?
idea.
I mean, I spoke to someone named Kalindi E. Have you heard of him?
Yeah, he's quite into his conspiracies.
Yeah, for sure. And he's into the very high doses of psilocybin. But it's his opinion that there is a conspiracy, that he believes the people in high levels in these organizations are using this stuff behind the scenes and not telling anyone.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I met a guy in Brazil who had he was a Swiss guy and a what do you call those guys who get he's a mercenary basically. That's what he was. That's what his job was.
Oh, wow. Okay.
before I knew him, he had a change of heart when he got into ayahuasca.
Oh, that's nice.
But he was training in the Bolivian jungle with ayahuasca. No, they were using it. Yeah, training. He didn't really go into exactly what the training was, but he said it's an amazing weapon of war.
No way. A mercenary training incorporated ayahuasca.
Yeah, that's what he told me.
Wow.
And I've got no reason to disbelieve him.
Yeah.
So I'm, I mean, the like we've had 40 years of really good research on cannabis being harmless, basically. And England in particular is really is very complicated about changing that rule. Things seem to be changing at the moment.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with science. It's because I don't know if you heard the story about Billy, the autistic kid, who was having really bad epileptic seizures, hundreds of them a day.
Yeah, I've heard. Yeah.
And Charlotte Caldwell, his mum, went to Canada and brought back some oil from there, declared it at customs, got it taken off her, and then there was this national outcry, and it looks like we may get a little bit of movement in the law. But basically, that was nothing to do with science, nothing to do with logic or reason or anything.
Public outcry.
Yeah, public outcry, which is the only thing that the British government are interested in.
Yeah, well, it's changing soon in Canada, which is exciting. Next month, it should be happening. Hopefully, cross your fingers.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be. Yeah, I mean, then you're going to have a whole lot of companies are going to be fighting over it as well. I mean, there's
There's going to be that. There's going to be the whole
complications on all
business
sides.
side and all that. I'm very excited, though, just to see that it's actually something's changing. And that will hopefully snowball into further change, too. And maybe something like mushrooms could be next or something.
I think the cat's out of the bag, really.
Yeah.
So I'd be surprised if we have another. I mean, you never know. We've got kind of rising fascists all over the world, so maybe it'll be stuffed back into the Tabernacle again.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like to hope that some things are changing.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. You really know your stuff. Like once you get into it, you've been doing a lot of research. I mean, your book is chock full of information too. You've obviously been working. It's not an easy process writing a book like that.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, I've got the first one is this one, Science Revealed. That's currently out of print, but I'm just it has some copyright violations and stuff. So I'm just
is that on similar topics as well?
That's about the history of science. Particularly, I'm looking at all my books. That one, those two, and the one I haven't written yet are about the apocalypse on some level, revelation,
right?
Something hidden being revealed. So that book there, that red book, Science Revealed, is about scientists who've discovered things when they're just waking up, or in flashes of inspiration, or on psychedelics, looking at Tesla's visions and Mendeleev.
Right, which is what you were sort of talking about at the beginning of the conversation for yourself too. That's how things kind of appear.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, exactly. So that one, and then so looking at how scientific journals massage, like what gets published, what doesn't get published, what gets funded, how reality is maintained on a more societal level. And the second book's more about neurobiology and linguistics of it. And the third book, which will come out one of these days, is about moments in history where you have lots and lots of new worlds discovered. So looking at, for example, when the microscope was discovered and the telescope and what it did to society.
I see. Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, opens up a whole new dimension, sort of.
Yeah, and tends to leave a great big body count in the in its wake as well.
Cool. Well, is there also like a way? Do you have a website or something that people, if they want to get a hold of you or see more of your work, or?
Yeah, I've got a website which is www.nemusend.co.uk. There's a load of talks on there and articles and stuff. Like I said, I've got this JPS article coming out at the end of the year. There's Psychedelic Press, Cypress UK, which has also got my publisher, and they've got a bunch of my stuff as well. What else? Recent talk I gave for Beyond Psychedelics has been published online as well. That's about neocolonialism in the study of the academic study of ayahuasca. So that's one to look up. I'm quite pleased with that one, actually. So look up Beyond Psychedelics and neocolonialism and Nemu, and you'll find me.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thanks a lot, Danny. I really enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun, man.
Yeah, me too. Thanks a lot, Carl. Appreciate it.